everyone. I'm Raisa. I'm here on behalf of the Foundation for Democratic Reforms. Today we have with us Dr. JP. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Raisa.
So, the UK elections have recently been concluded. The Conservative Party suffered a defeat after 14 years. We hope to get your insights into that today. So, to begin with, what is your general opinion on the way that the elections have panned out? I read somewhere that this was the election about the Conservatives losing more than it was about the Labour winning. What is your interpretation of how
I think
things
that's
have
the
taken
broad
place?
consensus across the political spectrum. All over the world, many scholars and commentators are saying the same thing because if you notice, while they got 410 out of 412, I think, out of 650 seats in House of Commons, the voting share is only 32%. And the Conservative Party and the party that took a lot of votes from them, the right-wing party created by Nigel Farage, they together got, I think, 25 plus 30, no, 13, 38%. So in effect, conservatism actually got more votes in the country. So Labour Party has not really got a mandate in terms of votes. But given the quirks of the first past the post system and given the split in the conservative votes, Labour Party got an unprecedented majority. I think in 1997, Labour Party got more seats when after Thatcher and John Major, when Tony Blair refashioned the Labour Party, he won a bigger mandate, slightly bigger than this. But this is an extraordinary mandate in terms of numbers in Parliament. So I think that comment is reasonable. But we must not also underestimate the importance of what Labour Party has done. You know, in the West, most often the real change comes not in the country but in the political parties, major parties. Margaret Thatcher transformed Britain by transforming Conservative Party. Similarly, Ronald Reagan transformed America and the world by transforming Republican Party, creating a new coalition. After that, Tony Blair in Britain, and even before that in 1992, Bill Clinton in the United States, they transformed their respective parties. Labour Party became a fiscally much more balanced, prudent party with Tony Blair. Similarly, Clinton's Democratic Party was not tax and spend party, but a very responsible governing party with a sensible agenda. So again, the country changed. In that sense, Starmer, he took over the Labour Party when it was in crisis. Twice in succession, they lost very heavily under Corbyn's leadership because of doctrinaire approach, old-fashioned socialism, government control, nationalization, so on and so forth. So he transformed it. In a way, this is a bit of a rediscovery of the Blairite Labour Party. And he took firm action to ensure that the party is cohesive, the message is clear-headed, and also pragmatic. It's more about management of the economy and the governance rather than some fantastic slogans and impossible promises. So in that sense, I think it's an unusual mandate, and it probably gives some space for stability and reform in the country because of the size of the mandate.
Yes, sir. So, when we talk about the electorate and the vote share as well, in spite of the Labour registering a landslide victory, even the smaller parties seem to have registered a substantial vote share in comparison to how they've performed before. How do you think going forward this will pan out with the Conservatives registering a defeat and the smaller parties such as the Reforms UK or the Liberal Democrats getting a better share? Do you think
You're absolutely right. Reform Party got 13% vote, though only they got, I think, 4 or 5 seats. I don't know the final tally. But Liberal Democrats gained. They probably got their largest tally in this election. I think they got over 50 seats and 10% votes. Actually, they got fewer votes than the kind of arch-conservative party of Nigel Farage, but they got many, many more seats. One important thing is the Scottish National Party, the local Scottish Independence Party, which became very prominent in Scotland politics in the past 10-15 years. That was decimated. From something like 40-50 seats in Parliament, they are now, I think, reduced to 6 or 7 seats. And Liberal Democrats did very well in the country. And already, Nigel Farage is talking about, if only it was proportional representation, he would have got more seats than the Liberal Democrats with 13% vote. That means about one-eighth of the parliament, let us say, you would have been entitled to about 80 or 90 seats in parliament, but you only got about 4 or 5. So in a way, this is a stark contrast between the vote share and the representation in parliament. It's always there in Britain, but this time I think it's much more stark. But I don't think it will have any outcome in terms of a push for change in the electoral system, because the Labour Party, which would not want such a change, is in a very handsome majority, and Conservatives and Labour would not like to normally have it. Once before, if you recall, there was a referendum in Britain on the electoral system, because in 2010, when Labour Party lost and Conservatives came to power under David Cameron, they didn't get a majority. They had to form a coalition government with Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats always wanted a proportional representation because they were a smaller third party. They wanted proportionality. And it was a precondition for formation of the government to place it before the voters. The voters did not accept it. The majority of voters preferred the status quo. And I don't blame them. In fact, if they asked me privately, I would also advise them, and the system is doing well on the whole. Doing well means there are 4 criteria for me. The first is, are political parties people's institutions, or are they private estates of individuals? In Britain, as in many Western countries, political parties are people's institutions. Anybody can go join them, and they're hospitable to talented people. So they're able to attract talent, public spirited people. 2, do they allow the rise of people in power through ethical and rational means? Ethical is obviously honesty, no bribery, no corruption, no, that sort of thing. But rational is even more important. Even if what you're doing is legal, but if economic policies are reckless, they're going to drive the country to bankruptcy. It is legal, but it is irrational. So ethical and rational. So does the political system give space for the rise of people to leadership through ethical and rational means? Britain, it's happening. The third is, are there clear alternatives offered to the people in terms of ideas and agenda? In general, in Britain, that is true, though this time there's not much of an agenda issue. People are vexed with Conservative Party. Labour Party appeared more sensible and probably safer pair of hands. But otherwise, there's no clear demarcation in terms of the agenda. But in general, in Britain, Conservatives and Labour, they offer clear alternatives. And finally, once a government is elected to office on that mandate, are they capable of delivering the mandate? In general, in Britain, again, yes, because Parliament has the supreme authority. If there is a clear majority with the people's mandate, generally they are able to deliver what they promised to the people. So once the system is working, proportionality is not that important. But for countries like India, that's much more important. But what's happening is, in the Western world also, just like in India we have seen the recent election, there is a volatility in voter behavior. People are swinging to extremes. People who voted for a particular idea or a party earlier, they're not sticking to that. Earlier, for generations, they voted, the family voted in the same manner to one party or one idea. Now, they're all switching loyalties very quickly. There's a lot of impatience. There's a lot of unrest in societies. And therefore, political volatility has become the norm. In that sense, if the voices are stifled because representation is not in proportion to the votes, there may be problems in the medium and long term. That's what this election shows. So I think there'll be some debate in Britain whether or not they should change the electoral system from the Westminster model that we embraced from Britain. Should they move to the continental European model? Almost every other European country has a proportionality model. It's an interesting thing. And also we'll have to see about the regional parliaments, Northern Ireland and Scotland, how they will shape up. There's always a large body of opinion asking for independence. Whether that will gain momentum or that will be now given up, we'll have to wait and see.
So, within this year, globally, the electoral outcomes seem to be shifting more towards the right, but the UK has voted differently. Can we attribute that to a larger shift that's taking place, or is it just mere anti-incumbency and anti-establishment that sets in after consecutive years of power?
In Britain, as you said, because of 14 years, if you remember, 1979, Mrs. Margaret Thatcher came to power, defeating the Labour Party. Conservatives got a big majority. Since 79, in the past 45 years, there were only 3 governments, though the prime ministers changed. and each election brings a new government. But in terms of the party, it's the same party. 1979 to 1990, Thatcher continued as Prime Minister. 90 to 97, John Major, both of Conservative Party. Until 1997, for 18 years, Conservatives were in office. And 1997 to 2010, Labour Party, first under Tony Blair, and then later under Gordon Brown. 2010 to 2024, though there was a quick change of prime ministers, particularly in the last 5 years, but still the same party in power. So in 45 years, there were only 3 changes in terms of political party governing the country. And after 14 years, particularly with COVID, with all kinds of problems in the country, with certain promises not being honored, with a lot of complaints about corruption and sleaziness. By Indian standards, there is no corruption. But they are thin-skinned people, much more sensitive to improper behavior in public office. And therefore, they quite rightly hold their leaders to account much more severely than us. And therefore, a lot of corrupt behavior by their standards. All these meant time for change is inevitable. So for the past 2-3 years, there was very little doubt that Labour Party would win the election. And the election outcome really proved that most of the opinion polls are right.
Yes, sir.
Whereas the rest of the democratic world, it's more than anti-establishment. There is a deeper unrest in society. There's a lot of anger and angst, partly because of the demographic changes, the aging population, but with welfare. Welfare takes away bulk of the resources. Therefore, fewer people are contributing to the exchequer, and more people are drawing from the exchequer by way of welfare, post-retirement, etc. And it's always a challenge. The second is immigration, particularly in Europe. Nowadays, even in America, perhaps the biggest issue politically all over the world now in the Western world is immigration. Even in Britain, immigration is a big issue. One of the reasons why Conservative Party lost public trust is they promised that they will solve the problem of illegal immigration permanently. They could not. I don't know if it's solvable or not, but they could not, and people are angry with that. America, much of the rise of Trump is based on stopping the immigration from the south, via Mexico, and rest of the Europe also, including otherwise liberal countries and countries of Northern Europe, etc., are deeply affected by the whole immigration issue from the Middle East and Africa and so on and so forth. The third issue is, for the first time, China became such a big, powerful industrial house that the West, which always regarded as the exporting class, the producing and exporting class in modern entrepreneurial economy, modern market economy, goods, particularly goods, suddenly they find that they're losing jobs and China is dominating. Global trade, they're nowhere. And even countries like India and others are slowly beginning to rise. So relatively, though they're still more prosperous than they were earlier, their relative prosperity compared to these countries is no longer in that comfortable position. Particularly if you go by purchasing power, the countries of the more enterprising economies of the third world, the developing world, they are now doing well. And in the foreseeable future, there is a realistic chance that they will, if not match them, they will actually increasingly challenge and compete with them. And that's also a source of tremendous worry. For the first time, in Western societies, there is a fear that the next generation may not be as well off as the earlier generation. For the past 100 years or so, it was guaranteed that your children will be far more prosperous than you. It was certain. But now there are doubts. So a lot of these things are making an impact on societies. If people are swinging from this to that, and they are attracted by right-wing ideologies, ultra-nationalism, or sometimes racism, and ultra-conservatism. So I think in a way, many democracies are going through this flux.
Yes, sir. So, especially with the Labour Party's performance, it seems as though they haven't performed as well within the Muslim population or the Muslim electorate. In some instances, also pro-Palestine contenders defeated their Labour Party counterparts. I want to draw a broader comparison that is it no longer possible to separate global and national, or is there always going to be an impact on your national views and your national policies on the way that your electorate perceives your broader outlooks as well?
Your point is valid. Take Britain, it has about 4 million Muslim population. Majority of them probably are first generation immigrants, though there was a minority which is second or third generation immigrants. Now, unfortunately, the fallout of Israeli-Gaza conflict as a result of the October 7th massacre of Israeli citizens, and then Israel's reaction, and then bombing in Gaza and attacks in Gaza and the death of innocent civilians, that has impacted much of the rest of the world. And the Muslim population is particularly very agitated about it emotionally. Labour Party is generally seen to be pro-minorities, where conservatives are supposed to be little less sensitive to minorities' needs. But because Labour Party has taken a nuanced stand, that while they don't want the kind of bombing and death of innocent civilians in Palestine, Israel has a right to defend itself. And the initial act was abhorrent and it cannot ever be condoned. They took an inflexible stand. And therefore, in order to put pressure on the Labour Party, in many constituencies where Muslim votes are significant, independent candidates were put up, and they have taken away a significant number of Labour Party votes. I think probably in about 20-25 seats, Labour Party might have lost that way. Even the former leader of Labour Party, James Corbyn, who is no longer in the Labour Party, he won as an independent because of this. They voted against the Labour Party. Even in the United States, you see a similar pattern. Again, Democratic Party is supposed to be more in favor of diversity. Republican Party is more in favor of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christians kind of a thing, though it's not that clear, but you can see a certain pattern. Therefore, the pressure is now not on Republican Party. The Muslim community in the United States is pressurizing Democratic Party now and the presidential candidate, incumbent President Joe Biden. And in America, as many people are aware, while 50 states go for elections and District of Columbia, the reality is the election for the presidency is limited to 6 or 7 swing states. The rest of the states is a predetermined outcome. This party or that party has a clear majority. Therefore, the might of American executive power is decided by 6 or 7 states by probably about 100,000 votes altogether. If 10,000 votes change hands in each of these 6 or 7 states, the government will change. So there's intense pressure in those states. So in those states, Muslims are putting up candidates or they're threatening to stay away from the polling or vote for a third party that will guarantee defeat of a Democratic Party candidate. So that pressure is now being built. So increasingly, particularly the Islamic community, partly because of the special circumstances, which are outside the politics of those countries, and partly because Islam is a global religion. Islamic Ummah is regarded always as above the nationality. Historically, Islam did not really recognize national boundaries. There is a larger Islamic society. And therefore, there is a sense of adherence, fidelity to a society beyond the nationhood. At least some significant section of Muslims, they tend to feel that way. Therefore, I think until the Middle Eastern problems are solved, the Palestinian problem and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this may actually get more accentuated, particularly in the era of social media. And even otherwise, I think in the long term, how do you handle the vast immigration from Middle East and North Africa? Most of the immigrants happen to be Muslims because in those areas, Islam is the dominant religion. And then how to integrate them with the modern societies. And finally, from a larger historical perspective, in one way, if you examine human history in the modern era, it's about transforming the traditional religious institutions and practices. While the faith and religion continued, but it reformed itself. Christianity, Hinduism, you can see, Judaism, etc. So Islam is probably going through that process of modernization. It takes time. It will not happen overnight. So how do you accelerate it without disruption is a challenge. So until that happens, I think some of these things will certainly impact democracies, particularly when they're vulnerable in terms of, a minority community having significant say in determining the outcome. Therefore, on a single issue advocacy, maybe on 99 issues you may agree with the party, but on that issue, one issue because you differ, you may vote them out. So those things probably are going to be increasingly interesting and challenging.
So, with the Labour Party now in power, do you foresee any major changes in the UK's domestic as well as global outlook on policy? I think the incumbent Prime Minister currently was also against Brexit at the time and had also resigned from his post.
Brexit is now a given. Nobody wants to touch it, because then you will create a fracture in society. It's over, they want to forget it. And therefore, Labour Party gave a clear commitment that they will not go back on Brexit. But they probably will have a more cordial relationship with Europe. Brexit does not mean that in terms of trade or in terms of other foreign policy or other related issues, you need to have enmity. Basically, Brexit came about largely because of immigration issue. As large number of people from Middle East and North Africa were migrating to Europe, and Europe being a very humane and European society being very welcoming in general as a principle to immigrants and sensitive to human rights, Britain felt as an island nation, they were also going to be swarmed by immigrants. So most of the British people didn't want anything to do with the rest of Europe if that's the price they had to pay. In their mind, that's the price that they would be forced to pay, accepting immigrants, particularly from the non-white countries. While they might not say that, the reality is if the immigration is from the white countries, white Christian countries, probably there's not that much of resistance. But non-white Muslim immigration, they're much more unwilling to accept it. And that probably led to Brexit. But now I don't think that will be reopened. There'll be better relationship. Otherwise, in terms of foreign policy, I don't think there'll be any fundamental change. Whether it's dealing with Ukraine or dealing with the rest of the world or about NATO or something else, I don't think there'll be any significant change. It's domestic policy. Even domestic policy, there are no serious ideological differences now as opposed to earlier era. Because now it's no longer the Labour Party which said we want to nationalize all industry. Our government must control everything. That's over. Corbyn, probably the earlier leader of Labour Party, had that kind of an approach. That's why he could not get elected. Twice his party lost badly. But now Starmer again reformed the party very much like Tony Blair reformed the Labour Party. So it's a modernist Labour Party with social liberalism and economic conservatism and improved public services. In fact, that is the hallmark of British Labour Party, particularly healthcare and maybe education. And maybe there will be also a greater accent on decentralization, local governments, etc. So that will be the accent. Otherwise, there are no fundamental fissures in terms of policy or ideology right now. They are both centrist parties, slightly left of center and right of center. Maybe conservatives are much more right of center than, and also some factions are far more right of center. Labour Party left of center, but otherwise, there is no fundamental disruption in politics or policy.
So, lastly, we also concluded the general elections in India recently. If we were to draw a comparison between the UK and India in terms of the political culture, the role of the media, and the electorate itself, what key takeaways do you think we could take or we could imbibe from them?
What is striking is the more mature you are as a democracy, the more experienced you are, and the more educated the population is, the more civil the conduct of the politicians is. While they fight on principle, there is a lot of personal respect, genuine mutual respect, and very civilized language of discourse. The abusive rhetoric that we seem to be seeing in India at the state level and national level is foreign to them. For instance, even in the last 24 hours, election day and counting day, etc., the two leaders of the government, the Prime Minister, outgoing Prime Minister, and the Chancellor of Exchequer, both used extremely positive and respectful language in talking about the next Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, the opposition leader at that time. And that's the way it should be. I think that's something that India would do well to emulate. Otherwise, in terms of conduct of elections, while they do it immediately and we take several days, several weeks of election, etc., but we are as good as almost any other country in terms of the conduct of election. But it's unthinkable that in Britain, you would buy your way into electoral office. You take the recent Andhra Pradesh Assembly election. It's widely accepted that about 40 crores per constituency per major party candidate is pretty much a norm. An estimated 15,000 crores probably was spent in the state assembly election, mostly state assembly, but also parliament. Telangana, earlier, a few months ago, we had the election here. An estimated more than 10,000 crores was spent in Telangana, a smaller state. Karnataka, last year we had the election. Again, an estimated 10,000 crores was spent in Karnataka. Tamil Nadu, the same thing. In Britain, we'll have the final figures. The total expenditure of all the candidates and both the major political parties and the candidates of both these parties in 650 constituencies, that means 1,300 candidates, together probably does not exceed about 100 million pounds. 100 million pounds is not enough in India to spend even in one state. There are assembly constituencies where money of that order is now being spent. At 100 million pounds, actually, I gave a big number. Last time it was only 28 million pounds. This time maybe 40 or 50 million pounds. There are Loksatta constituencies where that kind of money is spent in India at the current exchange value. There are assembly constituencies and by-elections where something like 250 to 300 crores, 400 crores was spent. These are extraordinary sums, but in one or two cases it happened. So the kind of expenditure that we are incurring in elections, mostly for illegitimate purposes for vote buying and enticing the people to vote for you, distribution of money, etc., is astronomical. And if you go with purchasing power, it's actually multiple times. Remember, British economy is roughly equal to Indian economy. And yet an assembly segment spends far more than 30 or 40 parliament candidates, parliament seats in Britain. It's ridiculous. What's happening in India in terms of election expenditure, illegitimate, unaccounted expenditure is extraordinary. We have normalized it. We are pretending as if it's business as usual. There is no desire to transform that. It's a very dangerous trend. Because if money of this kind, abnormal expenditure, illegitimate expenditure, unaccounted expenditure, is now going to give access to political power. Without that, you don't have a chance of political power. Power again allows you to make money recklessly. Then you have an extremely dangerous vicious cycle. In Britain, even minor infractions, £1,000 claimed the travel allowance when perhaps you're not entitled to get it. That's a very great scandal. In India, this is peanuts. We can't afford this kind of an approach. We have to bring sanity to politics and integrity to politics. We have to build an electoral system where illegitimate expenditure is no longer required and competent, public-spirited citizens can rise in public office through ethical and rational means. We can see the contrast very, very sharply in this respect. So, and finally, rule of law. Doesn't matter who is the Prime Minister or which party is in power in Britain or in many of the Western countries. There is real rule of law. The law does not distinguish those in power and those outside, those with money and those without money. The law treats everybody equally, and you get reasonably speedy justice, competent justice, and very efficient justice system, treating everybody equally. In India, we are very far from that ideal. So I think there are some areas where we should be proud of what we accomplished. There are some other areas where we have a lot to learn. The decentralization of power. Even in Britain, which is a unitary country, you have now regional parliaments. Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. They're practically like state assemblies in India. And local governments are pretty effective and powerful. Other countries are even more so, local governments. Our local governments are completely innervated. We have the weakest local governments in any democracy, perhaps in any large economy in the world. This simply is not conducive to good democracy. It's very inimical to sensible democracy. And one of the reasons why Indian democracy flounders on some issues is high degree of centralization, particularly at the state level. So we have a lot to learn from them. And there are also issues where we can be justly proud of what we have accomplished in this country.
So just as a last follow-up to that, do you think parties in the West, or taking UK as an example, are more amenable to modernization or to making themselves in tune with what the electorate wants? Because even the discourse around them or their political maturity is much more sophisticated, as opposed to India, where we're still, our main focus is just about getting in power and not what happens after that. Do you think that makes our parties more rigid in terms of reforming their ideas or their point of views?
You're talking about India or in the West?
I'm talking about in the West that the modernization seems to be more up to date, but in India we still
You're
seem
absolutely
to.
right. You see, there are several things that happen in those countries. Take Britain itself. One, quality think tanks adhering to certain philosophy and a framework consistently produce high quality literature based on research. And there is an interaction between civil society and these think tanks and institutions and the parties and the government and parliament. In India, that does not seem to happen much. These are two different worlds. The second is within government, there are institutions and practices which completely view politics differently. For instance, the shadow cabinet system. You don't merely attack a budget or something. You actually come up with an alternative and adhering to fiscal discipline. You can't simply wish away the numbers and lie your way. In India, for instance, when a budget is presented, if you're in governing party, you say it's a fantastic budget transforming the society radically. If you're in the opposition party, it's a disastrous budget destroying the country. There is no via media, there's no appreciation of what is happening, and there's no meaningful criticism. It became a joke. So public discourse is completely distorted. It's all either my way or highway. It's like two warring tribes fighting rather than a democratic discourse. And we have to learn a great deal. Similarly, within government, there are institutions and practices, like for instance, Office of Budget Responsibility. You can't simply come up with all kinds of freebies or some other programs. It has to be transparently examined whether resources are available, what will happen to the future of the finances, and so on and so forth. And you have to communicate to the people. In India, it doesn't matter whether the country will go to dogs, whether the nation will go bankrupt, the public finances are in already serious disrepair. You can make all kinds of promises, unreasonable, unrealistic, at the cost of the future of the country and the younger generation. And you want to make the political capital. So we haven't yet moved in a direction of examining public policy very carefully. Everything is enticing the poor, innocent people with short-term benefits at the cost of the long-term good. So there are many areas where we can learn from them. Rule of law I already mentioned earlier. So we certainly have to create a system where the rules of the game are honored by everybody. It's not enough to have them on paper. In India, there's no rule of the game. There's only one rule. Somehow win. Whatever it takes to win is perfectly okay. It's not right. Mr. Vajpayee used to say as Prime Minister that almost every member of parliament started his career by uttering a lie in public. That he or she spent within the limits prescribed by law, the election expenditure. And he used to openly say, all of us violated that. Let us change it. Though he didn't have the power and numbers in parliament, at least he was raising the issue and generating a debate. We are not even doing that of late. It's a big issue. It doesn't matter who wins or who loses. We have to see that our politics is compatible with integrity in public office. In India, increasingly, survival in power and integrity are not compatible. Even if an individual has integrity and honesty, institutionally you have to be part of a dishonest culture in order to survive politically. That's not a very happy place to be in. We can change it, we must change it.
Thank you for your time, sir. I hope everyone watching got a better insight into this. Thank you.